Wouldn't it be better if scientists were to become the heads of a one-world government, rather than leave the task to corrupt politicians? Well, we're not really the first to ask this question. Since the 16th century, in fact, the application of modern science in one field after the other proved to be so successful that it was only a matter of time before the philosophers of those days eventually turned their attention to politics. Centuries later, it seems that we've made little progress to a scientifically run state. But following the recent pandemic, this possibility seems to have gotten a second chance. Because whatever you may think about the actual forces pushing us towards a global society, it's undeniable that COVID, or rather the response to it, has moved our society towards more and more scientific control, towards a world of increased surveillance and data analysis, where human relations are mediated through social networks. A world where politics, at least in the way first conceived back in ancient Greece, is going to give way to scientific planning performed by bureaucrats and executed by artificial intelligence algorithms. What is especially worrying is that most living in the Western democracies seem to just go along with it, seeing no particular problem to any of this. Worst, they seem relieved to the abolition of politics and its replacement by a rule of experts. Yet, back when the ideals of Western democracy were being forged, some of the best minds had warned us about exactly what we are so giddily rushing towards: the surrender of politics to science. And Aristotle, perhaps the best among them, explains why. For the student of politics who wants to understand the differences between regimes and what their respective qualities are, the first thing to investigate is the city. What is it, actually? Aristotle opens chapter 3 of his book on politics with an obvious suggestion. To understand different regimes, the main topic of his book, one must first understand what a regime truly is. Aristotle does not use the word regime, of course, but polis, the Greek city, a word that remains strangely untranslatable. Because the city was not an urban unit like we understand it today, but a state as independent as nation-states are today. In fact, some of the cities, like Athens and Sparta, developed a culture that was so unique that some historians treat them as almost separate civilizations. What we call ancient Greece was never a nation, but a constellation of polis, of independent city-states, with Athens and Sparta being some of the most memorable examples. It is somewhat ironic that Aristotle, who exalted the great political achievement that was the city, wrote his thesis on the Greek polis just as the city-states of Greece had lost their independence, and after Philip of Macedon had conquered the Greek mainland and united its people into a single kingdom. If history were a film, then ancient Greece would be one of these characters who comes to understand themselves only a brief moment before they die. In this context, politics represents the moment of self-awareness, just before the final end, when, after entire centuries of living and dying inside of this great institution that was the city, a Greek could finally turn to his own culture's most unique achievement and ask the question, what is the city, really? And since the city is among the composite things, the things that are composed of many parts, it is clear that the first thing to be investigated is the part, the citizen. Aristotle then breaks into the core of his investigation in a way typical to a modern scientist. To understand something, we must break it into its components, just like we do with physical matter when we decompose it into molecules. Only that there's a slight problem. Aristotle is not a modern scientist, and his ancient reductionism should have rung some alarm bells to the careful reader. Does Aristotle truly mean what he said, or is this a ploy to show his careful readers something else entirely? But first, why does Aristotle's method of understanding the city as the sum of its citizens sound so modern? Well, because one of the fundamentals of modern science is what we call reduction, the process of reducing phenomena into smaller and smaller units, into elements like atoms, for instance. Think of how a scientist might define, say, a passing cloud. He will probably say that what a cloud truly is but a collection of water molecules that have originally come from the sea. What that means is that in reality, in his view at least, a cloud is essentially the parts that compose it. In turn, water itself can be further reduced as 2 parts of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen, the famous H2O that we learn at school, which also means that even water is not truly a thing in itself, but merely a sum, a collection of things. And ever since biology began to emulate physics, life forms have begun to be understood as merely a function of their molecules, like the DNA in our cells and the neurons in our brains. And Aristotle seems to be doing exactly that when investigating the city. As what molecules are to physical objects, so for the city, the Greek polis, we have, well, polites, citizens. So Aristotle begins to explain what citizens are. There is often much dispute concerning who is to be called a citizen, because someone who is considered a citizen in democracy is not necessarily so in an oligarchy. For starters, he continues, it's not a simple case of living together that makes a group of people citizens. Migrants can move in next to existing citizens without ever gaining the same political rights. Nor is it mainly having rights the defining factor either. Those simply visiting an ancient city, for example, were not allowed to vote, but were still protected by the courts when signing a business contract with an existing citizen. We are seeking the citizens in an unqualified sense, Aristotle says, in an objective sense, as we might say it, or in the matter that a scientist objectively defines the elements of hydrogen and oxygen in the periodic table, and whether these were found inside of a rock or in fact in a passing cloud. And so Aristotle comes up with the following definition. A citizen, he says, is the person having exousia βουλευτική ή κρατική, the right to vote and the right to hold public office. To be more exact, Aristotle says exousia κρατική, to hold juridical offices, to be able to act as a judge in the high courts of Athens. And that alone is fascinating, as we can hear the beating heart of ancient Athens resonating through this sentence. The city where a free man could be a soldier by day and an art critic by night, voting for the best theater play during the great festivals of Dionysus, while deciding whether to wage war with its neighbors. A city where power was controlled by being rotated constantly among equals. So, yeah, to hold power over the government and the courts sounds about right. But just when the reader might think that Aristotle has finally nailed it, this great philosopher turns around to say that this definition is probably true only for democracies and might not work for other regimes. What this means is that the same person who in Athens would be considered a citizen may not be considered one in Sparta. In scientific terms, that would be like formulating a definition of hydrogen that is only true for tap water, but does not apply when hydrogen is found in the open sea. Not much of a definition after all. But here is where Aristotle stops. So why does he do that? For some readers of Aristotle, this shows the philosopher's bias towards democracy, as he prefers to define the citizen in a way that only democratic communities actually would. But what is missing in their analysis is the subtle point that is constantly overlooked, no thanks to scientism, that if Aristotle shows any bias, it's not necessarily for democracy, but for the dominance of the whole over the part, in the exact way that modern science shows a strong bias for the dominance of the part over the whole. What we're being guided towards is a carefully laid trap, a trap that modern readers, so brainwashed by the dominance of science over any other forms of knowledge, fail too easily to understand. Aristotle's hands are guiding us in a full circle while trying to apply the reductive mindset to a problem that cannot be reduced. Because unlike the molecules that make up a cloud, in politics the citizen, the part, is itself defined by the whole and cannot serve as a building block towards understanding that whole. In his most poetic metaphor, in Book 3, Aristotle compares the city to a dance, where the dancers can remain the same, while the dance becomes different depending on the music that is being played. Depending, in other words, not on who, but on how they dance. And if you think about it, that is truly the case. What cannot simply define the tango, for instance, as a dance between two people, because that definition would also include the waltz. Rather, and as awkward as it may sound, the tango is a dance of two tango dancers, which of course is no definition at all, as it leads us back to the original question of what is the tango in the first place. But such little brain teasers are not without their use, and they give us the necessary insight that Aristotle was aiming for all along, by leading us into what modern scholars considered an intentional dead end. The insight that just like the dancer becomes a tangoist when he steps into the tango, so an individual can only be considered a citizen when placed inside of a specific city, a regime that will define what his actual role is, moving him according to its unique rhythm, Athenian or Spartan, thus becoming a democratic citizen while an oligarchic here. The individual who acquired this new status is like a stem cell that can become muscle or bone or nerve depending on where it finds itself in the organism. When Aristotle zooms in to understand the regime in terms of its parts, using instead of a microscope his own mind, one of the best our species has ever produced, he notices that just like with subatomic particles, the phenomenon he wants to understand suddenly disappears as it becomes fluid and unpredictable relative to the angle that one observes it. The point so is easy to miss by focusing on Aristotle's scattered phrases about the place of women and slaves that has so captivated modern liberals, is to understand the limits of the scientific mindset that is incapable of apprehending objects that cannot be reduced to their components. Thinking in ancient Greek is thinking in forms, giving preference not to the matter, but to the shape it takes. And some phenomena are best understood this way. Many years ago, public intellectual William Barrett observed that no sooner that science entered the modern world, it has become haunted by its shadow, scientism. What is this particular phenomenon we call scientism, he asks. It's not science any more than the shadow is identical to the thing itself. At most, science merely serves to heat up the imagination of certain minds, and they are not few, who are too prone to sweeping generalizations. Its conclusions are large and therefore sometimes pretend to be philosophical. And it's exactly this ideology of scientism that today, more than ever, blinds us to the possibility that science proper may have limits in some of the most important areas of our lives.